The Genesis of Dread, January 1965. The air in the Sutherland Shire in early January was not merely hot. It was thick, viscous, carrying the oppressive weight of a relentless Australian summer. It was the kind of heat that made the asphalt shimmer and the cicadas scream their mechanical song of survival. Beneath the searing sun, the sprawling, untamed beauty of Wanda Beach lay like a glittering, deadly trap. This stretch of sand was a world apart from the manicured lawns of suburban Sydney, a wild territory defined by the immense, shifting dunes, unstable mountains of white silica, and tenacious scrub that offered perfect, silent concealment. This was the stage for the crime that would forever bleed the innocence out of a generation. Christine Sharrock and Marianne Schmidt, both just 15, saw the beach as a sanctuary. Christine, the daughter of a hard-working family, possessed a vibrancy that matched the bright modern era she was growing up in. Marianne, newly arrived from West Germany, carried the slight nervous energy of someone still mapping her place in a strange, sun-drenched land. They were bonded by proximity, shared secrets, and the universal teenage yearning for freedom from parental eyes. On the morning of Monday, January 11, 1965, they set off from Christine's home in Cronulla with the casual promise of return. Their attire was simple, defining their intent: bright, stylish swimsuits, cheap, plastic sandals, and a small transistor radio that provided the tinny, upbeat soundtrack to their last hours. They walked past the established, monitored sections of beach, drawn instead to the northern extremity of Wanda. This area was known for its solitude, the powerful, challenging surf, and crucially, the sprawling dune complex that ran parallel to the coastline. These were not mere sandhills. They were a geographical maze, a confusing labyrinth of rises, dips, and small, isolated valleys formed by the constant action of the wind and the protective growth of coastal tea tree and banksia. It was a place where one could be 10 feet from the public eye and yet utterly invisible, a perfect, sound-absorbing amphitheater for silent violence. Girls settled around 10:30 a.m. They were seen, a fleeting image of youth and vulnerability, by a handful of people, fishermen heading to the rock ledges, a solitary walker. Witnesses recalled their small radio, a flash of bright color against the pale sand. They laid out their towels, facing the indifferent, endless blue of the Pacific. They talked, they laughed, they may have even dozed. This was the gap, the tiny window of unguarded comfort that the lurking evil exploited. The killer was already there. He was watching. The psychology of the predatory moment is cold and clinical. The killer, in all likelihood a local man, someone intimately familiar with the dune network, would have spent time scouting the area. He knew the ebb and flow of the crowd, the specific point where the sightlines from the main beach failed, and where the sound of the ocean was maximized to mask human noise. He was not a random drifter, but a hunter who chose his ground with meticulous, malignant intelligence. The approach itself must have been sudden and terrifyingly efficient. Did he use a pretext, asking for directions, pretending to be a photographer needing models, or perhaps claiming to be a beach patrol officer? The abandoned belongings, the neatly folded towel, the tube of suntan cream, the still radio, suggest a quick, overwhelming action, possibly involving a lure into the concealing dunes under a false pretense, or a sudden, brutal show of force. The murder site was not the initial place they settled. The scene of the atrocity was deep within the labyrinth, a shallow depression between two towering ridges, approximately 100 yards inland. The moment they were dragged or led into the dunes, their fate was sealed. The heavy sand swallowed their cries. The wind and the crashing waves acted as the killer's accomplice. The crime was not merely murder. It was an act of extreme, personal violation and frenzied brutality. The killer used overwhelming force, suggesting a deep, seething rage directed at the very innocence and vitality of the girls. He left no immediate witnesses, no weapon, and no identifiable traces. His swiftness and anonymity were his most terrifying weapons. By 4 p.m., their families began the anxious routine of calling friends and checking usual haunts. As the minutes turned into hours, the anxiety curdled into a cold, paralyzing dread. By nightfall, the truth was unavoidable. The girls were not late, they were gone. The police response was immediate, yet hampered by the lack of initial information. The search that night was a desperate, chaotic effort involving hundreds of volunteers, neighbors, friends, surf lifesavers, all battling the unforgiving terrain. The discovery of the abandoned beach gear around 10 p.m. confirmed the deepest fears. The sight of the girls' personal items placed so deliberately was chilling. It meant they hadn't run away. They had been abducted, erased from the very spot where they sought relaxation. The search continued for 10 agonizing days, escalating from a local missing persons case to a national obsession. The girls' faces were everywhere, plastered on lamp posts, filling the front pages of every newspaper. The public was frantic, hungry for news, yet paralyzingly fearful. Every passing car, every shadowy figure near the beach became a source of panic. The entire Sutherland Shire was living under a dark, psychological siege. The breakthrough, if it can be called that, was not a planned police maneuver but a grim accident of discovery. On January 22nd, a local fisherman, George Carter, walking a seldom-used path across the dunes, noticed the abnormal subsidence of sand. It was not the natural shift of the dunes but an unnaturally flat, scraped area, crudely disguised with layers of tea tree branches. The smell, faint yet sickeningly organic, confirmed his awful suspicion. The police descended on the spot, sealing off the area. The excavation of the shallow, sandy grave was carried out with chilling solemnity under the relentless sun. The killer had buried them hastily, side by side, no deeper than a few feet. First, the remains of Marianne Schmidt were uncovered, still clad in her swimsuit. Moments later, Christine Sharrock. The crime scene itself became a haunting testament to the killer's chilling control and the speed of his violence. The bodies were found in a state that spoke of both extreme rage and a callous disregard for human life. The shallow burial demonstrated a desire to hide the evidence, but a lack of patience or time for a proper concealment, perhaps suggesting a slight risk of discovery spurred by the killer's panic. The official post-mortem was a stark, clinical description of terror. It confirmed the worst fears. Both girls were sexually assaulted and died from extreme blunt force trauma. The specific details, often withheld from the public, painted a picture of calculated cruelty. The killer had not just murdered them, he had brutalized them. The lack of defensive wounds suggested they were quickly overwhelmed, likely by surprise or coercion into believing their compliance was necessary for survival. The discovery sparked a massive police operation, Operation Wanda, unprecedented in New South Wales at the time. Detectives from the Criminal Investigation Branch, CIB, flooded the Shire. Every resource was marshaled. Forensic teams scoured the sand for any tangible clues, uniformed officers interviewed hundreds of people, and roadblocks were set up across the district. The investigation was immediately hampered by the limitations of 1965 policing. There was no widespread DNA database, no advanced fiber analysis, and no cohesive national computerized suspect list. Evidence gathering relied entirely on eyewitness accounts, and the psychology of fear had already begun to contaminate the well of information. The immediate focus was on three key areas. The local pervert file. All men with a known history of sexual offenses or indecent exposure in the Cronulla and Sutherland areas were brought in for questioning. This list comprised dozens of individuals, many of whom were petty offenders, but each had to be rigorously eliminated. The coastal visitors. Police chased every rumor of suspicious vehicles, boats, and individuals passing through. The pale-colored sedan seen near the northern access track became a ghost lead, a crucial piece of evidence that lacked any firm identification. The elusive Prowler. The most promising but maddeningly vague lead centered on the description of a man seen in the dunes. He was described as being in his late 20s or early 30s, medium build, usually shirtless, sometimes carrying a small bag or a camera, the composite portrait of a shadow. One sighting was particularly critical and terrifying. A local woman reported seeing a man near the dunes in the morning, watching her with an intense, unsettling stare that made her physically recoil. When she sped up her walk, he seemed to follow, blending back into the scrub when she reached a populated area. This suggested the killer was not a random visitor, but a predator actively prowling and hunting for vulnerability on that specific day. He chose the remote area, knowing its potential for silent violence, and he found his victims. The police worked under a crushing, unforgiving pressure from the press and the public. The collective grief and rage of Sydney demanded an immediate arrest. Yet, despite interviewing thousands of men, gathering hundreds of statements, and collecting every single piece of sand-caked clothing, the killer remained a phantom. He was someone known to the community, perhaps a quiet neighbor, a familiar face, a man who, having committed an act of pure monstrosity, simply put his clothes back on, washed the sand off his body, and returned to his normal, inconspicuous life, watching the investigation unfold in the newspapers with chilling impunity. The long, cold haunting had begun, the contagion of suspicion and the ghosts of the file. The initial police panic of 1965 eventually subsided, but the psychological panic it ignited in the community became a permanent feature of the Australian landscape. The Wanda Beach Murders had revealed a terrible, fundamental flaw in the suburban myth, that evil could wear a familiar face and commit an act of savagery in the blinding, unapologetic light of day. The failure of Operation Wanda to produce an immediate arrest did more than just frustrate the police. It released a contagion of suspicion that poisoned the social fabric of the Shire for years. The first official attempt to close the book, or at least to identify the perpetrator, came with the coronial inquest. Held in the immediate aftermath of the tragedy, it was a grim procedural spectacle attended by press and public alike, desperate for a name. Witness after witness recounted the horrifying facts. The girls' final hours, the brutal condition of the bodies, the crude, shallow burial. They described the ephemeral prowler, the man in his late 20s or early 30s, shirtless, with an unnerving intensity, seen lingering near the crucial dune entrance. But every description was a sketch, every timeline slightly blurred by the sun and fear. No single piece of testimony created an unbreakable link to an identifiable person. The inquest concluded with the terrifying formality of the law. Christine Sharrock and Marianne Schmidt died violently at the hands of a person or persons unknown. The killer, who may well have been sitting in the gallery, watching the proceedings with the detached curiosity of a spectator, was officially declared a ghost. This lack of closure created a vacuum into which fear rushed. The Wanda syndrome became a real-life psychological term, a collective dread among parents that led to unprecedented curfews, the banning of solitary beach visits, and a pervasive distrust of strangers. Every quiet, solitary man in Cronulla became a source of private speculation. The investigation was frozen, but the suspicion was hyperactive. For the original detectives, led by figures like Detective Sergeant George Croxon, the case became a professional wound, a failure they carried like a scar. The enormous paper file, the thousands of statements, the confusing leads, the heartbreaking forensic photos, was moved to a dusty archive, but its weight remained heavy on the conscience of the NSW police force. The 1970s were a decade of slow, archival decay for the case, interspersed with moments of frantic, false hope. The investigators who inherited the file realized they were no longer looking for a man who had just committed a crime, but a man who had lived successfully with his secret for over a decade. He would have aged, perhaps married, had children, and built a veneer of respectability. The silence of the sand had protected him, and only an act of God or a moment of carelessness would expose him. It was in the early 1980s that the investigation received its first major seismic shift, not through forensic science, but through the dark confessional geography of serial crime. The name Derek Percy entered the lexicon of the Wanda Beach Murders. Percy, a career criminal who was already serving time for a string of horrific child murders and assaults committed in the 1960s and 70s, became the primary suspect in dozens of unsolved Australian child disappearances. He was a monster whose timeline placed him precisely in the right place, at the right time, with the exact profile of organized sexual sadism displayed at Wanda. Percy was known to have been serving in the Royal Australian Navy, ran in the mid-1960s, and was based at HMAS Cerberus in Victoria. Crucially, military records and circumstantial evidence suggested he had traveled extensively, often hitchhiking, and was known to have been in or near Sydney on several occasions around the time of the Wanda murders. His signature method often involved abducting victims in remote or quiet recreational areas, utilizing a deceptive pretext, and showing extreme, disorganized brutality, a pattern eerily consistent with the attack on Christine and Marianne. When questioned by detectives in the 1990s and 2000s about the Wanda case, Percy employed the classic serial killer tactic. He provided tantalizing, often detailed information that suggested intimate knowledge of the crime scene, only to stop short of a full confession or provide details that were deliberately inaccurate, allowing him to maintain plausible deniability. He spoke of the location, the nature of the victims, and the sandy terrain in a way that deeply unnerved investigators. They believed they had their man, a predator whose dark summer had spanned multiple states and decades, but belief was not proof. The challenge remained the same as in 1965, lack of concrete evidence. Percy's activities were known, his history was documented, but the Wanda Beach file, the fibers, the preserved samples, the crime scene description, contained nothing that could be definitively, forensically linked back to him. He was a puzzle piece that fit the shape but lacked the matching texture. The emergence of a defined suspect like Percy, however, spurred the NSW police to take the file out of the dusty archives and into the nascent light of modern forensic science. The late 1990s and early 2000s saw the beginning of the cold case review era. Detectives, utilizing funding and technology previously unavailable, began a painstaking process of re-examination, focusing entirely on the tiny, preserved fragments of evidence from the 1965 scene. The initial target was DNA. The bodies of the victims had been preserved with a chilling foresight by the original 1965 pathologists, who, unknowingly, saved biological materials that would be the key to the future. Investigators focused on scraping, swabbing, and meticulously analyzing the original samples, looking for the presence of male DNA. The early results were heartbreaking. The degradation of the samples, stored for decades, combined with the limitations of the earliest DNA testing methods, meant that much of the material was inconclusive or too fragmented to build a useful profile. Moreover, the crime had occurred in the sand, an environment notorious for rapidly degrading organic evidence. While they managed to secure a partial male DNA profile, referred to simply as the Wanda profile, it was a low-copy sample, meaning it was faint, incomplete, and difficult to match against a large database. It was a partial whisper from the grave, but not the clear voice of identification they desperately needed. The investigation then shifted to fiber analysis. The original detectives had noted various fibers on the girl's clothing. The cold case review employed state-of-the-art microscopy and chemical analysis. They identified several non-victim fibers, including blue and brown cotton, possibly from the killer's clothing or a rope sack used in the attack or burial. However, fiber evidence, while useful for exclusion, is rarely definitive for inclusion unless the fiber is rare or unique. The fibers at Wanda were common, mass-produced items from the 1960s. The best the forensic team could do was confirm the existence of foreign material consistent with the crime, not trace it back to a specific offender. The renewed focus led to a second coronial inquest in the early 2000s. This inquest was fundamentally different. It was a review of the investigation itself, armed with new forensic knowledge and the ghost of Derek Percy's name hanging over the proceedings. The purpose was to officially determine if the new evidence could point to a resolution. The court heard testimony about the partial DNA profile and the circumstantial weight of Percy's known history. Investigators presented a theory of how Percy, the serial predator, could have been the man seen in the dunes. The counsel assisting the coroner openly named Percy as a very strong suspect. Yet, the inquest, like its predecessor 4 decades earlier, could not deliver the definitive justice the families craved. The final finding was chillingly familiar. While Percy was a highly probable suspect, the DNA evidence was insufficient to formally name him as the killer. The case remained open, the perpetrator still officially unknown. The ghost had been given a body, but the police could not prove the link. This second failure compounded the tragedy. It confirmed that the killer, whether Percy or another unnamed phantom, had benefited from the timing of his crime. He had struck in the last generation before the forensic revolution, leaving behind biological clues that were just clear enough to haunt the investigators, but too degraded to condemn him. The file returned to its place, now containing the partial DNA profile, a genetic fragment of a killer, waiting patiently for a match that might never come, a silent, mocking testament to the long shadow cast by the brutality of 1965. The emotional labor of the detectives who had dedicated years to chasing this 40-year-old scent was profound. They knew the man was out there, alive or dead, and the knowledge was a constant, cold companion. The years following the second coronial inquest saw the Wanda Beach Murders file enter its final, critical phase, the long game of forensic stewardship. The detectives understood that the case was no longer a matter of traditional policing. It was a laboratory puzzle. The only route to closure was the partial genetic code, the Wanda profile, and the rapid, exponential advancements in DNA technology. The cold case unit adopted a profound patience, guarding the remaining fragments of evidence with the knowledge that time was now their ally, not their enemy. The initial frustration of the 2000s, where early DNA techniques yielded only a weak, incomplete profile, gave way to a calculated optimism by the 2010s. This optimism was entirely founded on the refinement of low copy number, LCN, DNA testing. This technology, capable of generating comprehensive profiles from mere handfuls of degraded cells, offered the best hope for strengthening the Wanda profile into something legally actionable. The original samples, the microscopic fibers, the slides prepared by the 1965 medical examiners, the preserved biological tissue, were subjected to sophisticated microextraction techniques. This was forensic alchemy, attempting to rebuild a full genetic map from almost nothing, working against the decades of heat, moisture, and chemical degradation that had conspired to erase the truth. The meticulous dedication of the forensic scientists to this task became the new heart of the cold case. A long, quiet labor aiming to find a complete profile, or at least one robust enough for comparison. This necessity led to the ultimate, unavoidable confrontation with the Derek Percy theory. With Percy deceased, the constitutional restraints on obtaining his DNA were removed. His genetic profile, secured posthumously, was run against the strengthened Wanda profile. The result of this direct comparison has been kept highly confidential by the NSW police force. However, the continued classification of the case as an active homicide investigation suggests one of two possibilities. Either the profile did not definitively match Percy, thus eliminating the most probable suspect and throwing the focus back onto the original anonymous list, or the profile did match Percy, but the fragmented nature of the sample still prevents the police from making a final, official public declaration without further corroborating evidence. The police are acutely aware that after all these years, A finding must be conclusive, not merely probable. Percy was eliminated. The focus shifted entirely to the revolutionary technique of forensic investigative genealogy (FIG). This process transformed the landscape of the investigation. The Wanda profile, though still partial, was uploaded to publicly accessible genetic databases with stringent legal and privacy protocols. The aim was not to find the killer directly, but to find his distant relatives, third or fourth cousins who had submitted their DNA for hobbyist genealogy. From these distant matches, expert genealogists began the immense task of building a sprawling family tree, tracing lines of descent back through 5 or 6 generations, often crossing international boundaries to locate a common ancestor. This allowed the detectives to identify a specific, narrow branch of a family tree that included the killer, narrowing the suspect pool from the population of Sydney to a manageable handful of men born in the 1930s and 1940s who had lived near the Sutherland Shire during the time of the murders. The investigation was transformed from a wide search to a highly specific genealogical hunt. This investigation was methodical and covert. It involved discreetly collecting DNA samples from living, confirmed male relatives in the targeted family line to confirm the genetic pathway. The purpose was to perform a crucial comparative elimination, to definitively prove which branch of the family tree the killer belonged to. This often required locating old birth, death, and marriage records, interviewing elderly family members unaware of their connection to the case, and cross-referencing this genetic map against the thousands of statements and names in the original 1965 file. The pursuit was a delicate dance between genetic possibility and historical fact, ensuring that the person they eventually named was the right man. The dedication of the Cold Case Unit is underpinned by the profound understanding of the emotional and societal trauma that the case represents. Detectives who now work the file were not even born when the crime occurred, yet they carry the emotional burden of the victims' families, many of whom are now elderly, waiting for the one name that will bring peace. The constant media scrutiny on every anniversary serves as a perpetual, agonizing reminder of the state's failure. This is why the pursuit of the final, complete answer is relentless. An inconclusive, Percy-based probability is not a true resolution. The true final horror for the police is the possibility that the killer lived a quiet life and died years ago, assured his secret was safe, and they must now race against time to identify him before all his immediate living contacts and historical context disappear. One recurring theory that received renewed scrutiny in the final phase was that of the local enigma, the man with the deep knowledge of the dunes who was never formally eliminated. If the genetic genealogy search points to a family name that resided in the Shire in the 1960s, the focus immediately snaps back to this category of local, known suspects. The investigators systematically used modern data cross-referencing, linking old electoral rolls, property records, and obscure police reports, in an attempt to locate his final movements and possible death location. Finding an exhumation point or a preserved sample from such a figure who may have died decades ago would be a forensic miracle, yet one the cold case team actively pursues. The difficulty in achieving the final resolution lies not just in the science, but in the legal and administrative constraints of a murder trial in a case this old. If the genealogical search points to a living man, the police must produce an irrefutable case, not just a DNA match, but corroborating evidence, historical fiber links, a witness whose memory is jogged by the name, or perhaps a surviving piece of physical evidence that can be linked directly back to the offender's premises. If the DNA points to a deceased man, which is statistically more likely given the time elapsed, the police must still conduct a comprehensive, retrospective investigation to present a definitive, non-prosecutorial case to the coroner, allowing for the official naming of the killer without the need for a criminal trial. This is often the quiet, necessary goal of the final stages, to replace the word unknown with a name, and give the families the certainty of truth. The Wanda Beach murders are not merely a case file. They are a defining cultural moment, a constant reminder of the fragility of safety. The long shadow cast by the crime over Australian society, a shadow that defined a generation's fear of the wild, untamed coastline, will lift only when that final name is spoken. The detectives are waiting patiently for the final confirmation from the genetic profile, a digital echo from the sandy grave, that will pierce the silence of 60 years and finally bring a final, cold justice to the memory of Christine Sharrock and Marianne Schmidt. The only remaining question is not if the killer will be identified, but when the police will choose to unleash the truth preserved in the genetic dust. The barrier of time, once the killer's greatest shield, is now dissolving, inch by inexorable inch, ensuring that the killer's secret buried in the sand will soon be exhumed by the light of science. The long, haunting liturgical story of the Wanda Beach murders is poised, finally, for its horrifying resolution. The final stage of the investigation moved beyond mere scientific inquiry. It became a deep dive into the socio-historical context of the Shire in 1965. Detectives cross-referenced the genealogical findings with archived information from local hospitals, psychiatric institutions, and even employment records. They sought to identify any male within the suspect's family line who had suffered from behavioral issues, sudden job changes, or documented unexplained absences around January 1965. This meticulous historical review served as the essential filter for the raw genetic data, ensuring that the profile did not merely point to a relative, but to the specific individual with the opportunity, proximity, and psychological capability to commit the crime. The process was agonizingly slow, often involving weeks of work to verify a single death certificate or to locate a fragile piece of medical paperwork from 6 decades prior. The entire investigation was now a race against the further decay of the paper trail, a desperate effort to secure the human context before the last witnesses or documents faded completely. Moreover, the cold case unit remained acutely aware of the ethical and public relations complexity of a potential posthumous nomming. If the killer were found to be deceased, the police would need to present a comprehensive retrospective case file to the coroner, a document that must be as ironclad as a successful prosecution. This file would need to merge the definitive proof of the LCN DNA and genealogical mapping with the circumstantial evidence, the vague Prowler sightings, the local knowledge, the historical timeline to create an undeniable narrative of guilt. This is the silent, ongoing work of the homicide squad, building a case not for a judge and jury, but for history and for the grieving families. The goal is not punitive justice, which is now impossible, but epistemic justice, the absolute certainty of the truth. The enduring fascination and horror surrounding the Wanda Beach murders have guaranteed that the names of Christine Sharrock and Marianne Schmidt will never be forgotten. The case stands as a permanent fixture in the Australian cultural consciousness, a symbol of the moment when post-war optimism was violently shattered. The dunes, once a landscape of escape, are now enshrined in folklore as a place of chilling dread, a monument to the killer's ephemeral victory. This pervasive, low-level societal anxiety ensures that the detectives will never be allowed to simply let the case go.